Hello, I'm Mary Ito, and welcome to the Cram Podcast. If you're a fan of podcasts, well, thanks for listening to this one. And if you listen to other kinds of podcasts, you may be hooked on one of the most popular genres, true crime. Fans just can't get enough of multiple murders, blood-soaked crime scenes, and the twisted behavior of psychopaths. Today, we're going to look at true crime, but not as a serialized version of a podcast. We explore the true stories of crime, murders that really happened, how they happened, who made them happen, and why many of these cases became cold, and with someone who knows all about murder investigation. Michael Arntfield is a criminologist, former police officer, researcher, and professor who's with Western University in London. That's where he founded the Cold Case Society. Michael is also a director with the Murder Accountability Project in Washington, and he's the author of over a dozen books, including How to Solve a Cold Case and everything else you wanted to know about catching killers. He joins us. Hi, Michael. Thanks so much for coming on our podcast.
Hi, Mary. My pleasure.
I have to say, I was absolutely fascinated, but also a bit freaked out by your book. There's a ton of information in it about murders and cold cases. And, your introduction, it really grabbed me because of two stories that you talked about. And the first was about the most prolific serial killer in the U.S., who, despite his reputation, is not as well known as he should be. Can you briefly tell us about Samuel Little?
So Sam Little is one of these cautionary tales that investigators or homicide scholars such as myself lecture about, which is the killer in the shadows, the killer on the road, the nomadic, random predator whose crimes really go undetected because they're not linked for many, many years, if at all. I mean, this is somebody who operated at random, picked his victims at random. They were victims who were sort of on the margins of society, that these cases weren't particularly investigated with any real rigor. And ultimately, it took just a keen-eyed Texas Ranger who figured out that maybe some crimes in Texas were linked to some similar murders in other states. And once they got this guy in custody, he was already in custody for similar crimes. But they realized this guy was a coast-to-coast killer, targeting women at largely at random, which made him so difficult to detect. And by the time really these investigations were underway or these bodies were discovered, he was already in a new jurisdiction. We've seen some killers do this before in the past. A notable name that comes to mind is Israel Keyes, whose main hobby was murder tourism across the U.S. But this is somebody who sort of is the accidental tourist, to draw on another famous piece of literature, who stumbled into town and would always claim a victim, to the extent that we still don't know how many women he's killed. And the closest sort of approximation of figuring out who these women are is he had a photographic memory of what they looked like before he murdered them. So he sketched out portraits, if you will, of what these women look like. And these drawings are being circulated among law enforcement for comparison to missing persons.
Mm-hmm. How many murders have been attributed to Samuel Little?
At last count, 52. Whether he's been officially, those have been cleared to him or attributed to him, which is the equivalent of charging him for them, even though he was sentenced to life in prison. But again, it's suspected to be in excess of 100.
Yeah, I mein, it's shocking. I think there are a lot of people who aren't familiar with his name, Samuel Little. Why do you think there hasn't been more attention brought to him?
Well, I had my own podcast for about a year. It was just a sort of the equivalent of a limited series like you see on a streaming service, and it was called Suspect Zero. And I had a co-host who was based out of New Jersey, and we called it Suspect Zero because there needs to be more discussion about offenders who have zero name recognition. There's too much emphasis on lionizing and glamorizing, celebritizing the same offenders over and over again. We don't need another series on Ted Bundy or Jeffrey Dahmer. We need to, I think there's far more important cases in terms of what we can learn from the flawed investigation, what we can learn in terms of offender mindsets, what we can learn in terms of victims or would-be victims protecting themselves from these other sort of parables or stories for which there is zero public footprint. So the idea was to cast a spotlight on some of these cases with a focus on victims, with a focus on how the investigations fleshed out, and really open up a new lane in true crime in terms of understanding that there's so much more out there that can really, I think, bring up the sort of credibility of true crime as a learning tool. And that was our objective, was to take these lesser known cases, sort of deep tracks. If you think about it in the music sense, you have your greatest hits that everyone hears over and over and over again. We're more focused on deep tracks.
Yeah, and one of the other I found shocking facts that you talked about in your book is that most murder cases do not get solved today, which I think is surprising to a lot of people because they think, oh, we've had so many advancements in technology. One would assume maybe there's more sophisticated policing and investigating going on, especially, if you live in an urban center. Why is that the case then, that most murders today do not get solved?
Well, we have to qualify that basically on local, regional, and national levels. So in Canada, in many jurisdictions, the clearance rate has remained steady around 75%. So 7.5 out of every 10 murders is cleared reasonably quickly, cleared being the law enforcement synonym for solved, or at least solved in terms of an arrest being made. But then there's the national picture. Some communities fare far worse, and they bring down the national average. And we do know in the United States, where this data is most readily available, and there are far more murders to draw on as a representative statistical sample compared to Canada, that in 2020, the clearance rate, the solved rate in the United States was lower than it was when standardized record keeping began in 1929. So going from about 70% to 1 in 2, and some cities again being more like 2 out of every 10 homicides being cleared, not factoring in the missing murders I just talked about, of which we don't know how many there are. Mm-hmm. So this is an unanswerable question as well, in that there can't be a single sort of independent variable that explains that. Is it offenders getting more sophisticated, watching more TV, consuming more true crime, understanding how to deploy forensic countermeasures or throw off police? Another one is distrust in police to the extent that people are less willing to cooperate. Well, in 2020 maybe, but there was also a sharp drop in like 1956 when confidence in the government institutions was at its highest. So it wouldn't explain it then. It might partially explain it now. And then clawing back funding to police. I mean, there's, as I mentioned in the book, there's well-known examples of there being fresh crime scenes and detectives not having a vehicle to get to the scene. That's how limited their motor pool is. So it's a perfect storm of financial, and cultural, and I think institutional problems that have led to this crisis in cold cases.
I want to go back to the second story that I found quite surprising at the beginning of your book, and it was about a serial murderer named Sam Gray of Ireland. Tell me about your connection to him.
So Sam Gray was a distant uncle of mine who was both a pub owner and chief of police, which apparently wasn't a conflict of interest in late 19th century Ireland, and is known to have killed 3 people for which he was tried and acquitted in what were clearly corrupt trials. And then local rumor has it, and there's a photograph in the book because the building still stands, the York Hotel, which he once owned, which is where his pub was, had rooms for let. And the rumor is when he died, or was imprisoned, and then his son, who was considered an accessory, was exiled to Australia, to the penal colony there. New people came in and bought this place and found multiple bodies walled up in the basement, sort of Edgar Allan Poe or old school mob style. That's never been independently corroborated. But the legend is that Sam Gray was a so-called butcher of Bally Bay. And on top of the known homicides, that there are these other murders that were committed, likely against perceived, again, criminal rivals or other people's trying to encroach on his business. He was a bit of a small time one man operation gangster. But I learned about this early on. My father's a sort of family researcher and a genealogist of some repute, and he was able to figure out that we're descended from this individual, and then that sort of, I mean, I don't want to overplay my hand and say, oh, that got me, on the road to law enforcement. But it certainly is a wrinkle sort of in my sort of own life story.
Yeah. And of course, I would think with that kind of discovery in your own family, you can't help but think about, nature, nurture, and the whole idea of that, killer gene idea. Like, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I don't exclusively believe in nature or nurture. And there's studies that suggest it's a combination of both, but certainly he's far enough removed that I don't think I have any of his
We're not
blood
in
me,
danger.
Yeah, no. It just, I mean, every family I think has an interesting skeleton in their closet. It just happens to be that by sheer coincidence, mine, given where my career has taken me, closes a circle in that, oh, actually, I'm, descended from somebody who's done precisely or engaged in precisely the same type of behavior. I've committed my career to identifying and catching and studying.
And another interesting fact that you talked about regarding solving murders. It's so the fact that that time is of the essence, I guess, right? When you're doing a murder investigation, and I think you said that if a murder is not solved within a certain period of time, was it 48 hours? Then the chance of it being solved, it seems to go down as time goes very quickly with each passing hour.
Yeah, so this is the whole basis for the long-running A&E series, the first 48, which I'm not endorsing, but is a very realistic, sort of over-the-shoulder approximation of how a murder investigation unfolds. And at least anecdotally, there is an understanding that after that 48-hour window begins to close, leads begin to dry up. After 48 hours is about how long it takes before, on average, for instance, CCTV footage records over at many institutions because they have only a certain amount of cloud space or in the old days, tape space. 48 hours provides enough of a window for somebody who's motivated to get out of state or even get out of the country to do so. 48 hours is enough for people to get together, come up with a story, dispose of evidence. And that's sort of the sweet spot in terms of number of hours post-discovery of a crime, not necessarily commission of a crime, but at least discovery of a crime, before things become exponentially more difficult. As everything is perishable. All evidence is perishable. There's biological evidence, documentary evidence, anecdotal, eyewitness evidence. People get influenced and corrupted. People forget things. So that 48-hour sort of benchmark is really sort of what investigators rely on as sort of the inflection point and where they should start worrying and where you really need to maybe call in more truth.
So then once those 48 hours pass and you're no further ahead, what happens to an investigation? Like, is it not as intense because so many other factors have gone by the wayside now? Like, what happens?
Well, it can frequently become more intense. I mean, I can recall cases where the murder weapon's not recovered. For instance, we have some evidence. We have a body. There's missing links, and they'll bring in 40 people to search a landfill. And I mean, so that is an intense, expensive undertaking, not done willy-nilly, but with the expectation that perhaps an admission was said, well, I threw it out here. We'll figure it. Okay, the transfer station for garbage thrown out here is at this location. Then it's moved to this landfill. We'll engage the operations manager at the landfill who say it should be in this quadrant. So it becomes you begin using different levers and you begin trying new methods versus just sort of putting it on the pile and saying, we'll wait for a new tip to come in. Bearing in mind, I worked in a jurisdiction with, 8 to 15 homicides a year. There are cities in the United States that have, 8 to 12 at the very least homicides a weekend. Cities like Chicago come to mind, right? So they do not necessarily have the luxury of brainstorming new methods of approaching cases when they're being inundated without relent with other cases. And that's really where the maxim, the first 48, it's in places like that, in hard-boiled locations like that, where that really is true to form, because
Yeah.
after 48 hours, you're back in rotation and taking new cases.
So when is a case considered cold?
So until 2 years ago, there really was no accepted legal definition for that. Some colleagues of mine and I devised sort of a working definition, which was, it doesn't need to be 30, 40 years old, as many of them are, the ones that you often hear about. Going back to the Black Dahlia in 1947, I mean, arguably one of the most famous sort of true crime, again, greatest hits that you can come across. But our definition was basically threefold. The original investigator is no longer assigned to the case, so there's a lack of sort of institutional and sort of institutional continuity and carriage of the case. There's no lab work or expert reports outstanding, so we're not waiting on DNA results or on an analysis of a tool mark or of ballistics that would provide pivotal new information. And there hasn't been an update to the investigative chronology or a new interview conducted with a prospective witness in over a year. So when you combine all three of those, you can see a case arguably could be cold, after about 13 months. Now, what happened was the Murder Accountability Project, and we're not a lobby group, I want to make that clear. We are like an independent think tank. But we did enlist the bipartisan support of two members of Congress, both Democratic and Republican, who basically put forward a bill that is now law as of 2022 in the United States, called the Homicide Victims Families Rights Act. And what this does is a law that allows for the families, or called representative persons, so someone acting in the interest of a victim of a homicide, to allow a judge to strip the investigating agency of the case and reassign it to a different police service if it's gone nowhere. So to do that, so all laws provide definitions. So to do that, we had to define what a cold case is. And basically, the lawmakers agreed on a period of 3 years. So the only legal definition in North America of a cold case is in the Homicide Victims Families Rights Act of 2021. And it stipulates that after 3 years of there being no clearance or no progress made on the case, an investigating agency can be ordered by a court to turn it over to a different agency to give it a fresh look. And that really hasn't been tested in court yet, but that is the next to investigative genetic genealogy, which is solving all these cases. That's the biggest leap forward in terms of cold case advocacy, I think, that's happened certainly in our lifetime.
Yeah. I mean, given your background and your breadth of experiences, what is it personally that drives you to study cold cases? Why do you do it?
Well, I mean, I first became interested in cold cases really as a police officer, where you'll be working a current case and you can see the history, as for instance, at a certain address. You can query an address that you're at and you'll see, somebody was robbed here in a home invasion 10 years ago. And it's just, maybe I over philosophize these things, but I think like it's so interesting, the intersection of people and places and time. And like at one house, you could have all these crimes and tragedies, and the people living there don't know what happened before. So I'm a bit of a history buff. I also believe I'm a strong advocate for victims and for justice, no matter how long it takes. So really, this is the synthesis of all that stuff. It's rigorous research using cases and what went wrong in order to help future investigators fine tune and improve their methodology. So they have an instructive purpose, and I'm an educator and among other things. So they have a great pedagogical, educational purpose. It's sort of living history, so to speak. And also, I mean, I like complex criminal investigations and always have, and these are among the most challenging. So from an intellectual and sort of a cerebral and I guess, just sort of psychological perspective, they really are fascinating. And I think if you asked anybody if they're interested, what makes cold cases fascinating to them, it's very difficult to put into words. It's sort of like, it's easier to know that 2 + 2 = 4 than explain how you know that. But you just know that cold cases really galvanize people. They're fascinating on so many levels. And to be a part of developing new ways forward and charting how these cases are solved. I mean, I've said publicly many times, with the advances in investigative genetic genealogy in just the past few years, the cases, whether they're unidentified remains cases or cold case homicides, being solved at a rate in North America of about one a week. I mean, within the next 10 years, it's foreseeable that we can retire the term cold case because using, again, the federal definition in the U.S. that we helped develop, cases won't get to the 3-year mark before they can be solved because every case is now solvable through this method.
For me, I think the saddest murders, and some of them were cold cases you talked about, were those invisible ones that you mentioned earlier. They occur and nobody even knows that they happened. Like, I mean, you can't solve a murder if you didn't know it happened, right?
Precisely. And I mean, the example I give in the book is particularly disturbing, where you have a serial killer who returns to the same house over the course of 2 years and systematically executes a family of 3. And the first 2 victims in separate incidents were respectively ruled natural and accidental deaths. So nobody's coded these as murders. Nobody knows they're murders. The killer must have been baffled as to why no one's looking for him. There's no stories about this in the media. So he keeps going back. And by the time he commits the 3rd murder, and is a serial killer by definition already by this point, he makes mistakes, things go wrong. Police then attend. It's clear this is a murder. And then they reinvestigate the first 2 and realize they got them wrong. Had it not been for the 3rd, those first 2 murders would have been invisible homicides forever.
Yeah. Can you just give us that case fascinated me. Can you just give us a little more detail? Because that was a family that was murdered.
Yeah, that was a family, and they were targeted by the new boyfriend of the estranged wife of the adult son living with his parents. After he separated from his wife, he moved back home. And basically in a revenge scheme, as well as to ensure that there would be minimal court battles in terms of the child custody, the boyfriend took it upon himself to go back and kill the father. That was ruled a natural death. Went back, broke back in, killed the mother. That was ruled an accident. She was found at the bottom of the stairs. And then with one surviving person, the adult son, who was sort of the source of the conflict, I suppose, went back and murdered him. And there was a struggle, and it was quite violent. And when police found that crime scene, they realized, I think, this is now the 3rd death in this house in not too long. Let's have a look at what else is going on. So, I mean, if that can happen to one family, in one house, in one city, imagine what the national picture looks like. And we know what it looks like in the United States. It's spent 2,500, a mean or statistical average of about 2,750 murders a year that go invisible, that go dark, that are never identified.
Yeah. You spend some time talking about serial murderers and how they commit murders. Can you just talk a little bit about that and the most maybe important things we should know about?
Well, I explain in the book that, and I have in a number of other my books as well, that there's been a number of theorized, what we call motivational models for serial killers over the years. For instance, the one I just mentioned is a serial killer by definition, but he sort of defies sort of the normal modus operandi of a serial killer. Most serial killers do not go back to the same location time and again. That was clearly a very personally motivated crime where he was looking to systematically, again, execute people he saw as adversaries to his own personal interests. But overwhelmingly, serial killers, I think, as most people think of them, is somebody who goes out and targets frequently, so predominantly men, who target females, who target a sort of archetypal victim, or what we call a preferred victim, someone they have in mind as a victim who they can control, who they can take maybe to a second location. And what do we have in nearly all these circumstances is some sort of restraint, some sort of undressing, some sort of sexual activity, whether it's a conventional sexual assault or whether it's some other bizarre ritualistic sexual activity. So you have to consider, again, when you look at the pantheon of, I think, some of the best known serial killers, Ted Bundy, what I call the greatest hits, the BTK Strangler. I mean, all of these are carried out, as twisted as it sounds, for pleasure, excitement, and fun. And the vast majority of serial homicide, therefore, mimics the sexual fantasies of these people. I mean, the work involved and the fact that they're able to do what they do to these people and they don't stop. I mean, this is why typically there's a victim. There's what we call a cooling off period or a refractory period, and then they want to do it again because this is exciting for them. Again, it mimics the sexual activity for them. And there's about 20 to 30 underlying identified forensic and clinical sort of drives or what we call paraphilias that prompt this behavior. Most of them end in philia. So you can think of some things that end in philia that if you are afflicted with those types of proclivities, you're going to probably end up hurting people. And
like pedophilia.
Pedophilia, necrophilia, as we'll go to Jeffrey Dahmer. So a child cannot consent, a corpse cannot consent, and inevitably, if you have one of these, you begin experimenting with other ones. And the bottom line is these are victims who cannot consent, and inevitably indulging them is criminal, why they're known as criminal paraphilias. And then what happens is some people are able to keep that at bay and just are sort of satiated by watching or listening to twisted things. They can otherwise manage, be functional in their lives. But like other, we'll call them disorders. It's not necessarily a disorder, but like whether it's a substance disorder, whether it's a gambling disorder, some are functional, some are non-functional and are actually degenerates. So the degenerate philiac will put their own pleasure in the pursuit of their own fantasies ahead of the health and safety of others. And in fact, if you throw some other things in there like psychopathy and sadism, the more pain and destruction they cause, the more they are satisfied sexually.
And what percentage of the population are we looking at with the most dangerous, the most disturbed?
Again, there's no way of knowing. There's no, people don't come out and self-identify as any of these things on standardized questionnaires. There are some loose estimates that say, about 10%, anywhere from 1 to 10%, depending on who you believe, of the general population qualify as psychopaths. So narcissists who lack any type of empathy or remorse. But most of them are not serial killers or even homicidal. They find other ways to control and manipulate and dominate people through certain professions, through certain relationships. That doesn't mean they're any less dangerous. It just means that they found ways, again, to be functional, much like the recreational drug user or alcoholics.
Yeah.
So there's really no way of knowing, which is partly A, what makes these people so dangerous, and B, I think why we're seeing fewer of the old school type of kidnapper, sex killers type of serial offender now because of improved understanding of these underlying pathologies and an ability to monitor them with sex offender registries. So the courts have finally understood. It took decades to realize, somebody standing at a window, so voyeurism, for instance, or now more recently installing a hidden camera in a bathroom. That's not a nuisance crime. That's somebody warming up. If they're interested in obtaining explicit images or watching people in non-consenting situations and having that power over them, they're not going to stop there. The interest in pursuing this will continue. And
but would it necessarily escalate though? Or could it just stop at the voyeurism?
In some cases, the preparatory paraphilia, which includes voyeurism, offenders can keep it there, but the risk of them escalating is so great and so unpredictable that if you're convicted of these preparatory crimes, you will go into the registry, and there will be somebody assigned to monitoring you to saying, "Listen, if you're interested in this, fine, but what are you doing for work? Are you in a relationship now with there's children in the home?" And just sort of keep the pieces on the board where they have to be to make sure this person does not escalate. And it seems to anecdotally be working because, again, we're catching these people faster now before they escalate.
Mm.
And there is, again, a dearth of, I think, again, the types of, and there's other factors as well. The fact that there's, 100 million CCTV cameras across North America and
Yeah.
Ring doorbells. I mean, that has changed the game as well. But there's other forms of surveillance that I think are tamping down on the ability of the serial killer types of old to really sort of crop up.
That's interesting, and that sounds encouraging. So we're actually seeing fewer of these kinds of crimes.
Yes, and we're seeing a shift, I think, more towards if they're serial offenders, the examples that I just gave of the Harrison family or of drug-related multiple murders, where, again, not necessarily gang or organized crime related, but the shift in the drug world currently is such that we're seeing more and more sort of these fringe groups of 3 and 4. They're not a gang. They're not organized crime. They have no ideology. They have no hierarchy. They have no structure. But there's nothing to stop them from killing 1, 2, 3, 4 people over the course of, weeks or months. And again, serial killers by definition, but operating according to a much different organizational and operational and motivational model than, say, John Wayne Gacy, or again, I'll bring up some of the names that most true crime people are familiar with.
I want to talk a little bit about the Cold Case Society that you founded at the university. And, I guess I would assume, and maybe other people might assume, that if you have people working on cold cases, they have to have some background, right, in murder investigation, have some kind of specialty, but not necessarily so.
So we see this on 2 levels. Investigative genetic genealogy, where there's 2 halves to that. So my students aren't necessarily doing genetic genealogy, although a couple of them are, along with a colleague of mine who's a professor, and we're really working towards standardizing how this is used at universities. But genealogists interested in family trees have never, in many cases, been homicide investigators or have any knowledge of forensics, but their own expertise in that narrowed esoteric field is invaluable. And investigative genetic genealogy, I mean, the police have the science. You need the genealogist on the other side. And this really represents, I think, the crystallization of an idea I had 15 years ago, which is we need to bring in experts who actually have fresh eyes and no knowledge of how forensics works, who have no sort of bias towards looking at a certain way of doing things, and just let them look at the evidence. So, I mean, we had a case years ago where we needed, we believed that there was what's known as a clandestine burial. There was a young girl kidnapped and we believe murdered and buried in a field. There was strong evidence that she was in this particular field and she was put there in a particular year. Her body had never been found. So we used the archaeology department to conduct ground penetrating radars where they normally look for underground tombs or artifacts. I can't read those results. I can figure out based on sort of offender behaviors what the likely place she would have been hidden would have been. But we need somebody completely objective who knows about underground scans and who knows about underground vaults and burial grounds to look at that. And there was an anomaly. It didn't end up being a body. But there's one example, and fast forward about 8 years, and now we have genealogists solving, with the assistance of police and vice versa, a case a week. So that's
a case
really
a week
using investigative genetic genealogy.
No, but with your Cold Case Society, how many?
No. This is just North America
okay,
wide.
Yeah.
North America wide. So the other thing that we do is, again, going to the Murder Accountability Project, and your listeners and viewers can go there at murderdata.org, is our algorithm. You can search cases in every city to see what cases are. You can search by cause of death, by weapon used. It's very difficult to explain. That's why we have AI sort of scan hundreds of thousands of murders looking for similarities. And every once in a while, the algorithm will return a presumptive hit, saying, these 4 or 6 or 14 homicides in this county all appear to be connected based on the age of the victim, gender of the victim, cause of death, and weapon used. Now, some of these, because the software just relies on the raw data. Some of these are going to be false positives. They'll return a match to a potential serial killer, and my students will go in and say, okay, Who were these people? We'll do secondary source research. Where do they go to school? Are all these cases still unsolved? Because maybe one has been solved and that takes that one off the table since the record was provided to us. And what they've done is help either screen in or screen out a number of these presumptive matches. And the key one is a set of 51 murders, strangulation murders of young women in Chicago, that became the basis for an investigation discovery series called The Hunt for the Chicago Strangler. And, whether you call that solved or not, we now have, and it's depicted in the series, a very good idea about who's responsible for those. And there's a reason they suddenly stopped, because the main suspect is in custody. But until we came along, nobody knew, because buried it, this group of needles in an even bigger stack of needles of hundreds of murders a year over the last 20 years are these 51 women who turn up here and there. But it's clear that to, the trained eye that this is a common offender. So again, same thing. You don't need to be on the ground looking through files. There's resources and technology now that are properly trained and motivated, expert in their own right. Whether it's looking at data, looking at family trees, can be, a key part of the mission.
I'm trying to remember. I think, wasn't there a story of a woman who was involved in your cold case society, and she ended up solving, or she was instrumental in catching a U.S. serial murderer? And actually, I think, didn't she speak to him?
Yeah, she called him on the phone, actually, after he had vanished in 1969 from New York City, where he had been on the run from Madison, Wisconsin. And he had a polygraph exam lined up with the NYPD on request of Madison, Wisconsin police for a murder there. And we believe other murders on campuses across the U.S. where he was bouncing around as a medical student. And nobody knew where he went. And then the internet caught up with the white pages, and the students in the club found him and called him, kept him on the phone as part of a one-party consent recorded, which is legal from where the call was placed in Ontario, for an hour or so, and elicited a sort of roundabout, tongue-in-cheek confession, I would say. That was turned over to police, and of course he, like we see in so many of these cold cases, died before direct action could be taken, or he could be arrested or properly then re-questioned in that polygraph that was supposed to have been done in 1969, revisited. Naturally, new guardrails were put in place by the university after that, where they said basically, and this is in my TED Talk at TED.com, where I talk about cold cases, but they said, these students can't be like
calling up serial killers.
Yeah. So at that point, we said, okay, just look at data, report back to me, and we've made just as much progress.
That's an incredible story, though. I mean, was it actually easy to track him down?
So this is the day of the internet where I think a lot of people hadn't necessarily thought about privacy. And what happened was a lot of home telephone directories, which don't really exist anymore, were just migrated by whoever, the telephone provider was in a certain region or state, to the internet. So if you had a publicly searchable white page listing, and it wasn't under his name, but we knew who his mother was, and he had lived with his mother, and she had since deceased. So it was old school sort of sleuthing that is made more difficult now, even in the age of sort of, in theory, everything being available at your fingertips. But now you need licenses, and you need all kinds of clearances, and you need to be able to weed out, duplicates or fake profiles. And it actually takes longer now than it did when sort of, we're talking, 2011.
Yeah. There's so many cold cases to mention here, but maybe can you mention one cold case that has really stayed with you personally? Like it's one that kind of is in the back of your mind, and you would love for this cold case to be resolved.
Yeah, so I mean, there's a ton to choose from. There's a number that we, and I say we, my group, homicide scholars, my colleagues, law enforcement are satisfied, are solved. They're not publicly cleared. Police can't come out and say it was this person. But we're satisfied we have an answer, much like in the case I just told you about from 1968, 1969. But there's some that are just absolutely out there. We have absolutely no idea. And it keeps me up at night wondering what else these people did because the crimes are so gruesome. And I'll just say that with the time remaining, there was three, I would say, that were sort of my Mount Rushmore of disturbing cold cases where we have no idea. And other ones I do have an idea. I know we can keep tabs on these people or they're dead, so I'm not worried about what they'll do next. I still would like an answer. Um, but the first would be Aaron Gilmore and Susan Tice in Toronto, which was recently solved using investigative genetic genealogy. Both women, strangers to each other, murdered in their beds in separate incidents in early 80s Toronto. Solved again using investigative genetic genealogy, and the police admitted we had no idea this person was even in the city. His name was never in the file. He's a complete ghost. And now the question is, what has he been doing between 2022 when he was arrested back to the early 80s? But now, and this person was alive when he was caught, so he's seen justice. He's pleaded guilty. So we have an answer for that. And I still have a lot of unanswered questions, but at least we know who it is. And the other two would be, and again, there's so many, but just off the top of my head, and I'll only cite them because I can refer your listeners to other resources on them. One is Jacqueline Dunleavy, who was murdered leaving her job in 1968, January 1968 in London, Ontario. And what was done to her suggests to me this was a mid-career sophomore serial killer. There's no question that he's gone on to kill other women. There is DNA in that case. There's been no match so far. It is a prime case for investigative genetic genealogy, and I hope that it is tested using that method soon. It's in my book, Murder City, where it is detailed at length. And the other one is featured in my series to Catch a Killer, which was originally on Oprah's network, which now is no longer available in Canada. And so it's been moved to Tubi, so it's available for streaming on Tubi. And it's the case of Margaret McWilliam, again, another early 80s case in Toronto. And again, absolutely vicious. I got to know that family very well. And it's a case that demands answers. There is DNA again. DNA that has curiously never been matched to the list of offenders that since the 80s has been processed into the data bank, which raises all kinds of questions. What happened to them? How they stayed out of trouble? How they eluded getting into the data bank? So again, another case prime for, again, ancestry-style investigative genetic genealogical testing.
Wow. Has there been a case where the serial murderer was brilliant and, maybe you couldn't really fault the police or the way the investigation was done because this person was so good at what he did and was able to avoid detection? Has there been a case like that?
Yeah, I mean, so many of them are just somebody, Robert Picton, John Wayne Gacy, who finds vulnerable people that no one's going to be looking for too hard. And it's a combination of institutional indifference, some jurisdictional, bungling, and just sort of there being one step ahead, as well as the limits of the time. But again, without aggrandizing anyone too much, I mean, he's featured in the first episode of my Suspect Zero podcast, the case of Israel Keys, which I mentioned earlier. I mean, this is a true nomadic, sadistic psychopath who lived in Alaska, but he had all over the U.S. at places he had marked on a map, these kill kits buried in remote locations. So he would fly from Alaska to, say, St. Louis, rent a car, drive 200 miles to where he had one of these kits buried, dig it up, and then just drive around looking for an unlocked house. He didn't care who lived there, and he would kill them and rape them and do whatever. Then he'd be back on the plane back to Alaska. So this isn't somebody who lived in the next town, the next state. He lives thousands of miles away. And he'd use his vacation time at work. He's self-employed, so he'd take time off and go on these murder holidays all over the U.S. And it was only once he got sloppy and started he targeted a barista at a coffee shop in his own hometown, that the police were onto him. Otherwise, they didn't have a clue. These victims were hundreds of miles apart, not a county apart. all corners
Mm-hmm.
of the country. And he remains a suspect in a string of really bizarre, violent carjacking murders also in Boca Raton, Florida. So they're looking at him for every crime, basically. Now they realize that this guy was even, this is something out of a horror movie. They had no idea
Yeah.
this guy was operating under their noses. And when I say under their noses, hundreds of different police jurisdictions. So they're now looking at him for all kinds of other things. And he killed himself in police custody, and again did something very strange and left a message for law enforcement in so doing that raises even more questions about what are the crimes maybe out there. But this is somebody, had he not got sloppy, was like the absolute, just a phantom killer.
Mm-hmm. When did he die?
I don't. This
Oh,
is like 6 or 7 years ago.
oh, and so when did these murders happen? Over what period of time?
Over the course of several years, like post 2000, again, that we know about.
Yeah.
After he relocated to Alaska he served in the military. They're looking at where he served in the military, as well as behavior there was extremely erratic, extremely
Yeah.
dangerous. And so we will never know where it started, where it ended.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I think, did you say he was self-employed?
Yeah, he was a contractor.
He was a contract. Yeah, because now I just remembered another thing you brought up, that there are certain common occupations with serial killers.
Yeah, this is somewhat dated research, but looking at a relatively strong data set of serial killers, largely from the 80s and 90s, but actually 70s through the 90s. Some scholars have broken it down into skilled, semi-skilled, and then unskilled. So that, and often the skill level of the trade or of the occupation, not surprisingly, mirrors the skill level of the modus operandi, whether this person is a highly organized and fastidious offender who's able to conceal their bodies and act with restraint during the crime versus, no, they're not. So there's some, I don't want to advertise necessarily what they are and hence, have people say, well, I have this job. I'm not a serial killer. It's not supposed to be causal. It's supposed to be largely
Yeah.
correlated or even coincidental. I mean, clearly, in some cases, I talk about this in my book, Murder City. In some cases, certain jobs naturally, like truck driving, I think we can say that with confidence without that surprising too many people, that truck driving, is, a hard job that, a lot of people graciously do, but also appeals to people who want to be nomadic and the stranger in town and want to be able to operate at night with impunity and go to what we call known vice areas where they can find people on the margins. So that is not a surprise. There's been studies on that. The FBI has its own division that looks at long haul trucking and what serial killers may be involved in long haul trucking. It's called the Highway Serial Killing Initiative. A book was just published called Long Haul by a former FBI assistant director about this very issue. And so that's one, but there's some lesser known ones as well that, and psychopaths as well. That's been more recently well documented. The preferred jobs of psychopaths, which, as I mentioned, are typically not homicidal. They'll find other ways of grinding people down and exerting control and toying with people.
Yeah. I just want to end off and I want to hang on to something that you said earlier, which I thought gives us hope. You were saying that there might even be a day when there won't be any cold cases because of the advancements we're making. Do you really think that? Do you?
Well, that's the hope. I mean, we're living in such an inflection point, and I'm closely watching a number of cases very closely because I mentioned that the Homicide Victims Families Rights Act has a definition of cold case, which specifies 3 years. Okay, that's one piece of legislation relating to one type of relief that can be sought by somebody in court, which is stripping the agency of jurisdiction, and having it reassigned to some other agency. But when you look at state, provincial, and federal definitions of various things, the definition of, for instance, roadway can vary. The definition of liquor can vary. The definition of impairments when driving can vary. So there's not one all-encompassing definition just because we now have a working definition of cold case. So the University of Idaho murder mass murder case, which is currently before the courts now. It's been moved to Boise in a change of venue. That is the freshest case where investigative genetic genealogy was used. And I mean, it was only a couple months old. And the argument, I think, in that case, one of the defense strategies is, well, this is supposed to be used for cold cases. Like, why is this being used in real time? This is prejudicial. They jumped the gun. They're using this experimental technique when they hadn't, tried everything else. Depending how that goes, you'll see IgG, investigative genetic genealogy, being used increasingly more in real-time cases. Why do we have to wait for a year, 2 years, or the 3-year mark, which is how it's defined in that other act? If you've tried everything in the first 48, let's go to IgG. And if that's the case, and you can get into a bloodline of somebody within the first 48, I mean, within a matter of weeks, a case that would take a decade or so previously to be solved can be solved. So at that point, after, is that a cold case? I'd say no, because it's actively being worked the entire time. The difference is we have a new tool to rely on after exhausting the neighborhood canvas, after exhausting the video canvas, after exhausting all the forensic tests, after exhausting, all your witness interviews. So foreseeably, yeah. And then once this is added to the toolkit, in theory, most cases will never get to that 3-year mark, much less that 30-year mark. God will.
That's incredible. That's a game changer then.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, congratulations on the work you do, Michael. I really appreciate your taking the time telling us about it.
Thanks for having me on. And I hope this motivates people to learn more about this, that there's so much more to true crime that is, allows people to, to impart meaningful, I think, insight and to be part of the cause versus just being passive viewers of this stuff. Go to murderdata.org. Check out my TED Talk on how people of all walks of life and all occupations can play a role. And this is really, I think, especially now, something where everyone has a role to play.
Great. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
That's Michael Arntfield. He is a former police officer, criminologist, researcher, professor of literary criminology and the criminal humanities at Western University. He's also the author of over a dozen books, including How to Solve a Cold Case. And if you'd like to know more about Michael and his work, please check out our show notes. We've got a bunch of links there. That's it for the Cram Podcast. We hope you enjoyed it. Please follow us on social. Our handle is @CramIdeas. Thanks for joining us, and see you back here next time.